Hello, everyone. I'm Eva, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our exceptional channel. Thank you for joining us on this exciting journey to enhance your listening, reading, and comprehension skills. Without further delay, let's begin part one of today's podcast with our guest, Lewis. Lewis, could you tell us what fascinating topic we'll be exploring today?
Thank you, Eva. Dear followers, welcome to your exclusive channel for English language acquisition. With consistent effort and commitment, you can unlock your full potential. Today's topic title is The Basics of Language Learning. Learning languages is not studying the basics first. It's about getting used to the language. We do that by acquiring words and phrases, and that is the fundamental task. It's not trying to nail down grammar rules until we have enough familiarity with the language. Those grammar rules are not that important at the beginning, but you won't necessarily be able to notice that when you're listening to the language until you have listened enough and read enough. After that, you will spontaneously notice that. In addition, noticing is a big part of language learning. That is another basic concept. Most of the things we notice without deliberately trying to notice them, and we notice them because we come across them so often. The basic structures of the language, basic phrases, and basic patterns, repeated over and over again in a variety of contexts. At this stage, we start to get used to them. Once you are used to some of these language structures, then go look at a grammatical clarification, as the grammar will clarify some concepts that you didn't notice before. The key habit for accumulating words and phrases is listening, as listening precedes reading, because first, when I listen once, there are some things I don't understand. So I listen, then I study the text, I look up words and phrases, so that when I listen again I understand a little more. I still don't understand the whole thing, but I'm gradually accumulating words and phrases. The advantage of listening up front is that it gives you momentum for your reading. Because when we read in a foreign language, we tend to subvocalize, so we have to know how the words are pronounced. And in fact, we know that good reading skills come from good listening skills. Good listening leads to good reading. Good reading is where you pick up the all-important words and phrases, and you start to notice them more and more. You notice them once in some listening or some reading, then you notice them somewhere else. And so there's a sort of a virtuous circle of exposing yourself to so much content that you start to notice new expressions. All of this is giving the brain a chance to get used to the language. As the brain is not very good at absorbing theoretical explanations, the brain is much better at creating linkages and recognizing patterns. As it gradually gets used to a new language, the brain is good at doing it, but it does it slowly. You have to feed the brain a lot of input, listening, and reading. Now in that listening and reading, it's important to have a good strategy. This is another basic concept that I think is very important, which is repetition in a smarter method. You cannot just push the brain to deliberate study, a list of words, grammar rules, conjugation tables, etc. The brain starts to push back. It's bored. The brain needs new themes. So when I start into a new language, I start first with interesting short content. I listen to it many times, but after a while, I am bored. And that's where I have to push myself into more new, interesting, and challenging content over and over again until the brain gets better at dealing with advanced levels. Wherever it may be, you should have a strategy that starts with a lot of repetition and then moves into more and more new, interesting, challenging content levels to keep the brain happy. And when the brain does something that it thought was difficult and it exceeds its expectations, the brain is fired up, gets a kick of dopamine, and that's what you should do. Basically, that's what I wanted to say. So get in the habit of doing a lot of listening, reading, and you will bring to light many language secrets. Finally, there are no basics in the language. You have to go out and discover them gradually yourself. The same holds for language learning. I have my basics of what I have discovered through my experience in language learning. Now it's your turn. You have to go out there and find your own path to language learning. See what you discover, see what you notice, see what are your basics. And once you're skilled at learning languages, you don't need the basics. So that's what I wanted to say about the basics of language learning. That was the topic of the day, Eva. Thank you for listening.
Well done, Lewis. Excellent work as always. What a fascinating topic to kick things off. We're thrilled you're here with us. Now, to our amazing followers, it's time to dive into part 2 of this episode. Sarah and David are taking the stage in a fantastic duo podcast. Let's get started right away.
All right, so today we're gonna tackle something that I think a lot of our listeners out there are super curious about.
Yeah.
And that is learning a new language.
It's a big one.
Yeah, big topic, right?
Huge.
Huge. Yeah, and we're gonna unpack some insights from Eva and Lewis,
Oh, yeah.
who host this awesome English learning podcast, and they've got some really interesting ideas about how our brains actually work best when it comes to learning languages.
Yeah, they have some really cool research-based stuff
Yeah.
that they talk about.
So we're going to dive into all that and kind of pull out those nuggets of wisdom,
Right.
right?
Absolutely.
So first of all, I think one of the biggest things that they emphasize is that you don't need to hit the grammar books right away.
Right.
In fact, they kind of say toss those aside, at least initially.
You know what that actually reminds me of?
What's that?
You know when we were talking before about how babies learn languages?
Yeah.
It's the same concept.
Oh.
They don't learn grammar rules first. It's all about immersion, building familiarity,
Yeah.
getting comfortable with the sounds and the rhythms and the cadence of the language.
Yeah.
So much of it is just absorbing that.
Yeah, it's like feeling the music before you actually have to
Right.
analyze the notes on the page.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I love that.
I love that analogy.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that they talk about that I thought was really fascinating is this idea of noticing. Right. So it's not just about like passively listening to a podcast or, watching a TV show.
Right.
But it's about really actively listening and trying to pick out those patterns. Like, oh, okay, why did they use that word there?
Yeah.
How is this sentence structured?
Like almost like a puzzle
Yes.
where all the pieces are kind of scattered around at first.
Right.
And you have to figure out how they fit together.
Yeah. And I think that that's something that can be really helpful, especially if you're feeling a little bit lost.
Or overwhelmed when you're first starting to learn a language.
Yeah, because you might feel like,
Yeah.
oh, I'm not making any progress. I don't understand anything.
Right.
But just by doing that, noticing, your brain is actually starting to make those connections.
Yeah, and I think they also really emphasize that listening is like king.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they call it the king and queen of language learning.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, a lot of people think, oh, I need to start by reading, or I need to get the grammar book.
Right.
But they really say, like, listening is even more important than reading.
It is, yeah.
Especially in the beginning.
Especially when you're first starting out.
Yeah, and I can see why that makes sense. Like you're hearing the pronunciation.
Yeah, pronunciation, intonation, like all of the nuances of how people actually speak.
The flow.
The flow.
Yeah, the rhythm, all of that stuff. But I guess my question is, can you really learn a language well just by listening?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think...
The answer is yes.
Really?
You actually can. I mean, think about how you learned your native language.
Right.
You were surrounded by it.
Yeah, for years.
Yeah, years and years before you ever picked up a book.
Yeah, that's true.
You were just listening and absorbing.
Yeah, and making those connections.
Exactly. And your brain was already starting to figure out all of those complex grammar rules without you even realizing it.
Wow, that's pretty amazing.
Right.
I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, but it's true.
So even if you don't understand everything that you're hearing when you're first starting out,
Right.
your brain is still like picking up on those patterns and those structures.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
So where does reading fit into all of this then?
Well, so once you've built that foundation,
Yeah.
through listening, reading actually becomes a lot easier
Okay.
because your brain is already familiar with the sounds of the language.
Right.
So when you see a word written down, you're like, ooh,
I heard that.
I've heard that before.
Yeah.
I know what that means.
Yeah.
And it kind of reinforces those connections.
So it's like a positive feedback loop.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The more you listen, the easier it is to read. And the more you read, the easier it is to listen.
I like that.
Yeah.
All right. So, but learning a new language, it takes effort.
It does.
It takes time.
Absolutely.
It takes dedication. So do Eva and Lewis have any tips for like making that learning process more effective?
Yeah, they do. They actually talk a lot about the importance of repetition,
Mm-hmm.
but not the boring kind.
Okay, that's good.
Like
Yeah.
drilling flashcards over and over again.
Right.
They're really big on making things fun and engaging.
Okay. Yeah.
So finding things that you actually enjoy,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's podcasts or music or movies or, whatever clicks for you.
Yeah.
And just immersing yourself in the language that way.
So like find something that you actually want to listen to or watch.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because if you're bored, you're not going to stick with it.
That's true.
Right. Yeah, I definitely learned that the hard way.
Oh, yeah.
I remember like trying to learn Spanish in high school,
Mm-hmm.
and I had this like super dry textbook,
Oh.
and I couldn't get into it.
Yeah, it was just like pulling teeth.
Yeah, it was awful.
No wonder you didn't learn very much.
It's all right.
You gotta make it fun.
Yeah, you got to make it fun.
Find something that you're actually passionate about
Mm-hmm.
and then use that as a way to learn the language.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
So it sounds like there's not really like one right way
Right.
to learn a language.
That's another big point that they make.
Yeah.
It's a personal journey.
Hmm.
What works for one person might not work for another.
Right.
So it's really about figuring out what works best for you
Yeah,
and experimenting and trying different things.
I like that.
Yeah.
So I guess like just to kind of sum up some of the key takeaways from Eva and Lewis.
Yeah.
First of all, we learned that tossing the grammar books aside
Right.
initially is not as crazy as it sounds.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually a really good idea to
Right.
just focus on that immersion and familiarity first.
Yeah, get that feel for the music.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Exactly.
And then we talked about the importance of noticing those patterns.
Absolutely.
Right.
Actively listening and looking for those connections.
Yeah. And then listening is key.
Listening is king and queen.
King and queen.
Yeah.
That's the foundation.
Gotta get that foundation.
Yeah.
And then repetition. But it needs to be fun,
Yes.
right?
Make it enjoyable for yourself.
Find those things that you actually like
Mm-hmm.
and use those as your learning tools.
Absolutely.
All right. So any final thoughts, any like parting words of wisdom?
Yeah. I would say just remember that it's your journey.
Mm-hmm.
There's no right or wrong way to do it.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid to experiment.
Mm-hmm.
Try different things. Find what works best for you.
I love that.
Yeah. And this deep dive has given you those foundational tools.
Yeah.
But now it's time to build your language learning masterpiece.
I love that so much. You can do it.
Yes, you can do it.
I believe in you.
All right. Well, this has been so insightful. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Of course, it's been a pleasure.
And for all of our listeners out there, if you have any, language learning tips or stories or questions,
Yeah, we want to hear from you.
share them with us. Yeah, we would love to hear from you.
Absolutely.
And until next time, happy learning.
Happy learning, everybody.
See ya.
Hey.
Big thanks to Sarah and David. You're a powerhouse duo. Lewis, we've wrapped up another exciting podcast. Before we end, let's add even more value by summarizing the main takeaways from today's discussion. This podcast episode challenges the traditional approach to language learning, arguing that immersion through listening and reading is key, rather than focusing on grammar rules initially. The co-host emphasized repetition and gradually increasing content difficulty to keep the brain engaged and motivated. They highlight the importance of noticing patterns organically through repeated exposure, suggesting that understanding grammar should come after building familiarity. Ultimately, they advocate for a personalized learning journey where individuals discover their own effective basics through experience. Dear followers, if you like what we're doing, please subscribe, tap the bell, leave a comment, and follow us for more. Thanks a lot. I'll leave you with a big smile and my heartfelt respect. Catch you in the next video.